Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. We are currently on Chapter 8, which is entitled Gang Suppression. We are beginning to read Reforms, the section about reforms. Okay. Efforts to take a more nuanced approach to gang and youth violence attempt to closely target youth believed to be at high risk of crime and use social support services to try to steer them off the streets. The two best known models have been the Spergel model and, quote, focused deterrence, end quote. Irving Spergel at the University of Chicago developed a comprehensive model for gang intervention that has received extensive support from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The model calls for a robust mix of suppression strategies and social services. At its best, it involves collaboration between law enforcement, schools, social service providers, and local communities with an aim toward developing the most appropriate tools to address local conditions. Some plans involve intensive enforcement toward young people using coordinated teams of police, parole, and prosecutions, while also attempting to provide family support, job training, and socialization skills development. Quote, focused, end quote, or, quote, targeted deterrence, end quote, initiatives function in much the same way. Developed by criminologist David Kennedy and first implemented in Boston in 1996, they attempt to stop gun violence through intensive and targeted enforcement combined with supportive services and appeals from community stakeholders to stop the violence. Ideally, this model begins with a community mobilization effort in partnership with local police. The goal is to send a unified message to young people that gun violence will no longer be tolerated. If it occurs, they use every resource at their disposal to apprehend the assailant and to disrupt the street life of young people involved in crime across the board. This is called, quote, pulling levers, end quote. The hope is that young people will choose to avoid violence so that they can concentrate on socializing and low-level criminality free of constant police harassment. This is based on evidence that a great deal of shooting was not drug-related, but involved tit-for-tat revenge shootings by warring factions. The key is to break the cycle. To achieve this, police develop, quote, hot lists, end quote, of young people they believe are more likely to engage in violent crime based on a host of sometimes secret factors like prior arrests, involvement in foster care, and even school performance. The young people are called into meetings with local police and community leaders and threatened with intensive surveillance and enforcement if the gun violence doesn't stop. These, quote, call-ins, end quote, are made possible in part because many of these young people are on probation or parole for past offenses. There's usually an effort to develop some targeted social services to offer education and employment opportunities. In New York, under the banner of Operation Ceasefire, if violence does occur, a call-in, the entire population of young people is targeted for aggressive prosecution on any arrest, or after a call-in, even if they were not part of the call-in and had no knowledge of the initiative. These models are very similar and rely primarily on intensive punitive enforcement efforts. While focused deterrence is more concerned with gun violence, both models rely heavily on traditional gang suppression efforts of investigations, arrests, and intensified prosecutions. The social services offered tend to be very thin, involving some counseling and recreational opportunities, but rarely access to actual jobs or advanced educational placement. Life skills and socialization classes do nothing to create real opportunities for people, instead reinforcing an ethos of, quote, personal responsibility, end quote, that often ends up blaming the victims for their unemployment and educational failure in communities that are poor, underserviced, segregated, and dangerous. Research on these programs does show some meaningful declines in crime that can even last for years. Overall, though, the results are thin. Most reductions are small, occur only in a few crime categories, and don't last very long. They also continue to reinforce a punitive mindset regarding how to deal with young people in high crime, high poverty communities, most of whom are not white. It is certainly true that violent crime is heavily concentrated among a fairly small population of young people in specific neighborhoods. It makes more sense to target them than to indiscriminately stop and frisk pedestrians or to arrest hundreds of thousands of young people who have either done nothing wrong or are engaged in only minor misbehavior. Despite the claims of the broken windows theory, there really isn't a strong connection between the two groups. The targeting is problematic because police fail to understand the often amorphous nature of gang membership and the fact that one prior offense does not necessarily mean a strong, long-term commitment to crime. This is also a profound invasion of privacy. People are subjected to intensive police surveillance based on a perceived risk rather than any specific criminal or even suspicious behavior. This, quote, predictive policing, end quote, is just another form of profiling of young men of color. Most young people who engage in serious crime are already living in harsh and dangerous circumstances. They are fearful of... Give me 1 second here. I'll get something to drink. Mouth a little dry. Sorry about that. Okay. Most young people who engage in serious crime are already living in harsh and dangerous circumstances. They are fearful of other youth, abusive family members, and the prospect of a future joblessness and poverty. They don't need more threats and punishment in their lives. They need stability, positive guidance, and real pathways out of poverty. This requires a long-term commitment to their well-being, not a telephone referral and home visits by the same people who arrest and harass them and their friends on the streets. Bill Braden, in his first stint as NYPD commissioner, pointed out that police officers are not social workers. They're not trained for it, not prepared for it, and that's not their role. Why would they be suited for engaging these young people as mentors or life skill trainers? They aren't. In addition, deterrence theory rarely applies to the young people being targeted. As noted, they are driven by emotions and short-term considerations and impulsiveness, not carefully calculated long-term risk assessments. Violence among this group is often driven by fear, anger, and humiliation, not calculations of material gain. Threats, intimidation, and incarceration merely intensify those feelings of low self-esteem and, yes, humiliation. In the end, focused deterrence is really a continuation of the punitive practices already employed. Some police officials who have spent years using punitive methods have begun to question them and look for alternatives. Joe Dominic shows this process playing out in Los Angeles. LAPD Chief Charlie Beck, for example, has come to embrace a more community-centered approach. Beck had been an active participant in Daryl Gates' Operation Hammer, but began to see that without community support, they could accomplish little of long-lasting consequence. He began to reach out to organizations and young people who were already out on the streets trying to reduce the violence as, quote, gang interventionists, end quote. The LAPD had treated these groups with suspicion or even revulsion in the past. Many are former gang members who had spent time in jail. Police saw them as too close to the street and too critical of the police to be trusted. Beck came to understand that this was exactly what made their work possible. Beck brought them in to discussions for the first time. The most concrete outcome was police support for the role of violence interrupters. In the end, though, this was primarily about securing community support for more nuanced but still primarily punitive law enforcement. What remained was a still dysfunctional system of law enforcement and largely unconnected youth programs. Advocates, such as Connie Rice at the Advancement Project, understood this but were unable to get the city council to realign its emphasis despite putting together an extensive report. A call to action, the case for a comprehensive solution to LA's gang violence epidemic, which documented the failures of the suppression model and the dysfunction of existing efforts. Today, the overall focus of the LAPD remains on suppression, with some nods of the role of community-based gang interventionists. In fact, in 2014, the LA Youth Justice Coalition developed a plan to redirect 1% of the LA County law enforcement budget towards social programs for youth, including community centers, youth jobs, and violence interrupters. That 1% would generate around $100 million a year, a rhetorical intervention that has yet to bear fruit. Okay, and then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. And yeah, let's have a reflection on that real quick here. One of the things that stands out the most is that these are still very, very much punitive measures that are being used in all of these different methods of reform. I think that one of the things that is important about understanding the mentality and the psychology and the actions in some of these communities is understanding the type of desperation that exists in them and understanding what that breeds. And once you understand that, you can have a better understanding of certain actions that they take and can see them as human beings and see them as people who have just, again, been marginalized and have been exploited and oppressed, and their circumstances, they're very much products of their environment. And these measures of reform don't take that into consideration enough because of the fact that they continue to use these punitive measures, and none of these reforms target the core realities as to why they end up in these gangs and why this gun violence and all of these things happen and exist. I hope I'm and really they laid this out well. I think this, out of all the chapters, this is probably one that is I'm the least familiar with. Some of these other chapters I've read multiple times, and have even had like conversations about on different platforms we have. And so a lot of these things are going to be better said by Alex Vitale in this book. But I do still want to, for myself, do the work of challenging myself to put some of these concepts and some of these ideas in my own words, because it's a good practice to get into. And I want to sort of encourage that exercise for people who are listening. I think it's important to be able to read something and to be able to digest it and comprehend it, and then be able to put it in your own words when you're speaking to somebody else about it, or to be able to take the parts of it that are relevant to your situation and be able to articulate to people about the issues that you were just informed about or read about or learned about in some way. And I think a lot of times the best way to do that is to, right after digesting something or right after reading or watching something, to have a conversation about it. And it forces you to begin to find words that can express your perspective on whatever it is that you just took in. Alternatives. Redirecting resources from policing, courts, and jails to community centers and youth jobs is crucial to the real reforms needed to reduce juvenile violence. We are spending billions of dollars annually to try to police and incarcerate our way out of our youth violence problems while simultaneously reducing resources to improve the lives of children and families. It makes much more sense to reduce racialized, segregated poverty, provide troubled kids with sustained treatment and support, and provide communities with tools to better self-manage their problems without the use of armed police. First, we must have a real conversation about the entrenched, racialized poverty concentrated in highly segregated neighborhoods, which are the main source of violent crime. It is true that crime has declined overall without major reductions in poverty or segregation, but the crime that remains is concentrated in these areas. Unlike aggressive policing and mass incarceration, doing something about racialized poverty and exclusion would have general benefits for society in terms of reducing poverty, inequality, and racial injustice. In a bit of an overgeneralization, Elliot Curry argues that we need three things to reduce youth offending. Quote, jobs, jobs, and jobs, end quote. Most young people would gladly choose a stable, decent paying job over participation in the black markets of drugs, sex work, or stolen property. The United States is more segregated today than ever before. It allows up to 25% of its young people to grow up in extreme poverty, something that just isn't tolerated in other developed countries. It is from that population that most serious crime originates. The research on whether a short-term increase in the supply of youth jobs, often temporary and low-paying, reduces crime has shown mixed results. What remains to be tested What remains to be tested is what would happen if there were a sustained increase in decent paying jobs over several years. Such an increase might be able to overcome the educational and even cultural dynamics that contribute to black market participation and violence. Not every young person in these neighborhoods is ready and able to work, even if jobs were available. So the second plan is doing something to improve stability for these young people, so many of whom have been subject to soul-crushing poverty, abuse, and violence. So many of whom. What's remarkable is not how much crime they commit, but how little they do, given this extreme deprivation. For years, the proponents of austerity and neoconservative tough-on-crime politics have claimed that social programs and treatment don't work. Of course, no single program by itself can end serious crime. Too often, in their scramble for resources, supporters of these programs make overly ambitious claims that set them up for failure. Midnight basketball by itself won't bring an end to crime any more than police athletic leagues will. In many cases, the programs that do get funding tend to deal with those young people with the fewest needs. But most programs avoid those who need help the most. Those that do serve them and tend to have the best results, but only when they involve a sustained, comprehensive approach that deals with both their problems and those of their families. Such, quote, wraparound, end quote, services have to be at the center of any youth violence reduction program. Finally, we need to build the capacity of communities to solve problems on their own in true partnership with government. The primary face of local government in poor communities is the police officer, engaged primarily in punitive enforcement actions. Why not build community power and put non-punitive government resources to work instead? Michael Fortner argues that African Americans played an important role in ushering in the era of mass incarceration and over-policing by demanding that local government do something about crime and disorder. What this analysis misses is that many of these same leaders also asked for community centers, youth programs, improved schools, and jobs, but these requests were ignored in favor of more police, enhanced prosecutions, and longer prison sentences. It's time to revisit this equation. Communities often have good ideas about how to reduce crime through non-punitive mechanisms when given access to real resources. One model for pursuing this is community-based restorative justice. In this model, community members, through a representative body, are asked to assess the risk of taking some offenders back into the community instead of sending them to prison. They use some or all of the resources that would have been spent on incarceration to develop rehabilitation and prevention programs. One study found that New York State was spending more than $1 million a year to incarcerate people from a single square block in Brooklyn, and there are many such, quote, million-dollar blocks, end quote. Most communities could find ways to spend that money that would achieve much better results than those produced by heavy-handed policing and mass incarceration. Jobs programs, drug treatment, mental health services, and youth services would all help reduce crime and break the cycle of criminalization, incarceration, and recidivism. At the same time, this model would engage offenders in restitution and harm reduction projects to help repair the damage they have caused. Abandoned houses that are sites of drug dealing and violence could be rehabilitated to provide stable housing. Older youth could be trained to mentor younger ones about how to resolve disputes without relying on violence, stay in school, and prepare for a difficult job market. So much of the youth gang and violence problem stems, as David Kennedy's research points out, from a sense of insecurity. When young people are constantly at risk of victimization, they turn to gangs and weapons to provide some semblance of protection. Communities need help in exercising informal controls to try and break this dynamic. There is no one solution to this, but active, positive adult involvement in the lives of these young people will be a major step in the right direction. This would require developing the capacity of parents to be more involved, which means looking at the structure of working hours and the high cost of childcare. Often parents are unable to supervise their children adequately because of the intense demands of multiple jobs with erratic schedules. We also need to invest in drug treatment and mental health services to address the difficulties some parents face in managing themselves, much less their children. Youth workers, coaches, and school counselors can all play a role in mentoring and monitoring young people. In too many cases, however, we are replacing them with more police. When communities demand more police, those resources have to come from somewhere else, and too often they come from schools and community services. This all squares nicely with austerity politics, where social programs are slashed to make way for tax cuts for the rich and enhance formal social control mechanisms. Another way to empower communities is to invest heavily in public health-oriented prevention programs that operate at the neighborhood level. Often undertaken under the banner of, quote, cure violence, end quote, these programs try to send strong anti-violence messages to young people, engage them in pro-social activities like after-school art and job training programs, and hold workshops in nonviolence conflict resolution. They also employ outreach workers as violence interrupters, who can talk to young people from a shared position. The power of that connection for building credibility cannot be overstated. These workers are trying to break the cycle of violence through rumor control, gang truces, and ongoing engagement with youth out on the streets. Some places are trying to move in this direction. Minneapolis has a, quote, blueprint for action to prevent youth violence, end quote, a multi-agency effort involving government, nonprofits, and community members. Unlike gang suppression efforts, it's housed in the health department rather than the police department. The blueprint brings people together to discuss existing problems and programs and tries to coordinate their efforts and prioritize funding for new services and initiatives. It's a flexible, real-time process that responds to conditions as they change. The two main drawbacks are a lack of resources and a lack of buy-in from the police department. This creates a dynamic where young people who are involved in programs and positive activities are still being harassed and arrested by the police. These programs are not a panacea. Research on their effectiveness is limited and shows mixed results. That is because they need the other parts of the solution to be in place as well. Without community-level changes in employment opportunities, adequate social services for young people with serious life problems, and improved educational structures, no one program can end the violence. There must be a holistic approach that begins by reducing our reliance on the criminal justice system and building political power to demand more comprehensive and less punitive solutions. Okay, and that brings us to the end of Chapter 8, Gang Suppression. And then that will bring us to the beginning of Chapter 9, Border Policing. And let's have a reflection. Again, we see in the alternatives that are suggested that there are a few places that are already beginning to implement some of these new ideas into their policies and procedures, and also the alternatives that are suggested strike at the root of the issue, which is leading to people being involved in gangs and leading to communities and neighborhoods and locations having to deal with the negative effects of gangs. And I think one of the things that is important to do with all of these chapters is to look at them in conjunction with each other. And so the same communities and areas and groups of people that that are dealing with this, it is the same groups of people and communities that are dealing with all of these negative aspects of these different forms of policing. It's the same neighborhoods and same communities and people who are dealing with the police officers that are policing sex work, that are dealing with the police officers that are inside these schools. It's their children that are dealing with the school resource officers. It's them who are more vulnerable to have untreated or undiagnosed mental health issues. So it's them who are dealing with police officers when they have some type of mental health crisis. It's them who dealing with police officers when they're between homes or homeless. You know, you're not going to be on the wealthy or rich upper class side of town or upper middle class side of town and see people having encampments and people being homeless and people sleeping outside. Those things are going to take place in specific neighborhoods and specific areas. And it's in being from specific communities make you more likely to end up in those areas and to end up being the people that are either unhoused or that are in a neighborhood where there are unhoused people. And so the same thing exists with and then with the war on drugs, those same communities are more likely to have drug sales taking place in the open air market or behind closed doors in hotel rooms or in houses and in apartments and in projects in these communities that are lower class, that are working class, that are predominantly black and predominantly of color, because of the fact that there has been an acceptance from dating years back from the powers that be that these people can sell drugs within this area, can be in gangs and commit violence within these areas. It's not unless these things bleed out that there is some type of heavy emphasis put on it. And that is one of the things that has existed through time. That you see when you hear about these things that take place in these cities and in different states, it's the same areas that deal with violent crime, the same areas that deal with drug uses and drug selling. And so this is part of the cycle and the system that is in this country. And I say all those things to say, finally, gangs become a result of all of these other things. Like people are facilitated to sell drugs sometimes through a gang. People who maybe grew up in broken homes and didn't have a home can find that type of familial comfort they're looking for within a gang. People who grew up not having money, or somebody who may have grown up with and decided to go into sex work can find protection through a gang or through some type of organized group of people in working community or lower class community that comes to take on the title of gang. And so I guess really what I'm getting at, I'm sort of just having a stream of conscious thinking out loud. But really the main thing I'm trying to get at is that it's important to be able to see and perceive how all of these different things are connected with each other, and then do the exercise of articulating the connections. So that way when you are communicating with somebody, you can already have that muscle memory in place in your mind where you can be able to connect the war on drugs to school resource officers and police in the school to prison pipeline, and connect that to criminalizing homelessness, and then connect that to PMI, policing people with mental dealing with mental health issues, and that is when we get to the point of truly educating people about the need to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice as we know it, because it is a cycle that is because it is a destructive cycle. Okay, so please do me a favor and share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on, and be on the lookout for new episodes of Rockford Reading Daily coming out every day to provide you an opportunity to begin and further on your journey to end police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. Holla at you tomorrow.